what the Bible really says about Isaac and Ishmael. Most people believe they already understand the story of Isaac and Ishmael. It is often presented as the beginning of a division so deep that it echoes through centuries of history, a moment when two brothers became symbols of rival destinies. One was chosen to carry a sacred promise, while the other was pushed aside, and from that point forward, their descendants were believed to stand on opposite sides of a great and unending divide. It is a story that has been repeated so often that it feels settled, almost unquestionable. Yet when the ancient text itself is read slowly and carefully, a strange sense of uncertainty begins to appear. The familiar interpretation starts to feel less certain, as though something important may have been overlooked. The story in the Bible is far quieter than the version many people imagine. It unfolds not in the language of war or permanent hatred, but in small moments, personal decisions, and human emotions that feel surprisingly familiar. Beneath the surface of the narrative there are details that seem ordinary at first glance, short verses, brief encounters, subtle reactions that appear almost insignificant. But these details begin to take on a different meaning when they are examined closely, like pieces of a puzzle that slowly form a new picture when placed together in the right way. The more carefully the story is observed, the more it begins to raise questions that most readers never stop to ask. The tension between Isaac and Ishmael is usually treated as obvious and inevitable, but the text itself often moves quietly past the very moments where such hostility might be expected. Instead of long descriptions of rivalry, the narrative focuses on the fragile relationships inside a single family. A father caught between hope and uncertainty, a mother struggling with fear about the future, a household shaped by promises that seemed impossible to understand. These were not symbols when the story first unfolded. They were people living in a harsh and uncertain world, a world where survival depended on family loyalty, divine favor, and the fragile bonds that held a household together. Abraham was not yet the distant patriarch that later generations would imagine. In the earliest moments of the story, he appeared simply as a man who believed that God had made a promise to him, a promise that seemed both extraordinary and difficult to comprehend. He had been told that his descendants would become a great nation, more numerous than the stars in the sky. Yet the years passed, and the promise remained unfulfilled. Time has a way of changing how people understand faith. What begins as certainty can slowly turn into quiet doubt when the future refuses to unfold as expected. Abraham and his wife Sarah had already grown old by the time the promise was spoken, and with each passing year, the possibility of a child seemed to slip further away. In the world they lived in, a family without children was more than a personal sorrow. It threatened the future of everything they had built, leaving their name and legacy with no path forward. Within this quiet tension, the story of Isaac and Ishmael began to take shape. But it did not begin with rivalry between brothers. It began with uncertainty, patience, and the difficult choices people sometimes make when they are trying to understand what God intends for them. The promise that Abraham believed in was vast and mysterious, but the reality of daily life demanded answers that could not wait forever. As the years continued to pass, the gap between faith and reality grew wider, and the household itself began to feel the pressure of that silence. What makes the biblical narrative so remarkable is the way it captures these human struggles without dramatic explanation. The text rarely pauses to analyze the emotions of its characters, yet their choices reveal everything. Hope, fear, impatience, and loyalty are woven quietly into the decisions that shape the family's future. What later generations would interpret the beginning of a historic divide was, at its origin, simply a family trying to navigate a promise that seemed impossible to fulfill. The world around them offered little comfort. Ancient tribal life was unpredictable, and survival often depended on strength, alliances, and the ability to protect one's household. In such a world, the birth of a child carried enormous significance. It meant stability, continuity, and a future that could extend beyond a single lifetime. For Abraham, the promise of descendants was not merely a spiritual blessing, it was the foundation of everything he believed God had spoken over his life. Yet the path toward that promise did not unfold in a simple or predictable way. The story moves slowly, shaped by moments of human decision that carried consequences no one could fully foresee. Ishmael would eventually be born under circumstances that seemed to provide an answer to the long years of waiting. For a time, it may have appeared that the promise had finally taken shape through him. But the arrival of Isaac later would introduce a new layer of complexity that few could have imagined. What makes the narrative so fascinating is not merely the events themselves, but the quiet tension between what people believed would happen and what ultimately unfolded. The characters inside the story often acted with confidence, convinced they understood the meaning of their circumstances. Yet the biblical text itself leaves space for uncertainty, hinting that the true significance of these events might be more complicated than anyone realized at the time. Over the centuries, the story of Isaac and Ishmael has been told again and again, often framed as the origin of a lasting conflict between nations and traditions. But the original narrative does not present itself as a declaration of permanent hostility. Instead, it reads like the unfolding life of a family struggling with faith, expectations, and the mysterious nature of divine promises. And when the story is examined with patience, the assumptions that many people bring to it begin to shift. Certain verses that once seemed straightforward begin to feel strangely ambiguous. Moments that appear small suddenly carry greater meaning. It becomes clear that the relationship between these two brothers cannot be understood simply as the beginning of a rivalry. The text itself refuses to simplify their story in that way. This realization opens the door to a deeper question, one that has quietly lingered within the pages of Scripture for centuries. If the Bible never clearly declares that Isaac and Ishmael were destined to remain enemies, then why has the story been remembered in that way for so long? Long before Isaac and Ishmael were remembered as figures in the register history, the world they were born into was harsh, uncertain, and constantly shifting. The land where their story unfolded stretched across dry hills and open wilderness, a region where survival depended on movement, alliances, and the fragile rhythm of seasons. Families did not live inside permanent cities as many people do today. Instead, they moved from place to place, following grazing land for their animals and searching for water that could sustain their households. Life in this ancient world was built around tents, flocks, and the quiet understanding that tomorrow's safety was never guaranteed. Abraham's household was part of this wandering life. His camp would have been large, filled with servants, shepherds, animals, and relatives who depended on his leadership. In the ancient Near East, a man like Abraham was not only the head of his family but also the center of a small community. The choices he made affected the lives of everyone under his protection. His wealth was measured not by coins or land titles, but by livestock, by the strength of his people, and by the honor of his name among neighboring tribes. The landscape around him was beautiful in its own severe way. Rolling hills gave way to long stretches of wilderness, where the wind carried fine dust across the ground. During certain seasons, the land would bloom briefly with grass and scatter flowers, giving life to flocks of sheep and goats. But these moments of abundance were temporary. Much of the year was marred by dryness and relentless sun, reminding those who lived there that survival depended on careful planning and strong faith. Within this world of movement and uncertainty, the idea of legacy carried enormous weight. A man's future did not end with his own lifetime. It continued through his children and the generations that followed them. Without descendants, a family's story would simply fade away, leaving behind little more than memories carried by distant relatives. For Abraham, this reality made the promise he believed he had received from God both astonishing and deeply personal. According to the biblical narrative, Abraham had been called away from his original homeland. He had left behind familiar territory and traveled into lands that were not originally his, guided by a promise that seemed larger than anything he could fully comprehend. The voice he believed had spoken to him promised that his descendants would become a great people and that the land before him would one day belong to them. It was a vision of the future so vast that it stretched far beyond his own lifetime. Yet promises like this did not remove the difficulties of daily life. Abraham and Sarah were already advanced in age when these words were spoken, and with every passing year the promise seemed harder to imagine. The ancient world did not view age the same way modern society does. Growing older meant that certain possibilities simply disappeared. When a couple reached the later stages of life without children, it was widely assumed that their chance had already passed. Inside Abraham's household, this reality would have been impossible to ignore. The servants, relatives, and workers around him all understood the importance of an heir. Someone would eventually need to lead the camp, manage the flocks, and continue the family's name. Without his son, everything Abraham had built could scatter after his death, leaving his people vulnerable and his story unfinished. Sarah felt the weight of this situation more deeply than anyone else. In the culture of that time, a woman's ability to bear children was closely tied to a sense of identity and honor. The absence of a child was not merely a private sorrow. It carried social and emotional consequences that affected her standing within the household. Years of waiting must have filled her with quiet frustration, watching time pass while the promise that Abraham spoke about remained distant and uncertain. The Bible presents these circumstances with remarkable simplicity. It does not pause to describe every emotion or inner conflict. Yet the tension can still be felt between the lines. A promise had been given, but the path toward its fulfillment remained unclear. Abraham continued to believe that God would act, yet hope and life does not exist in a world of endless patience. The pressure of time pushes people toward decisions that seem reasonable in the moment, even if they later reveal unexpected consequences. This was the atmosphere in which the story of Ishmael began to take shape. The household had lived for years under the shadow of an unfulfilled promise. The expectation of a future heir had become part of daily conversation, lingering quietly in the background of every passing season. When hope stretches across many years without visible change, people begin to search for ways to help the future arrive. In the culture of the ancient Near East, there were social customs designed to address situations like this. If a wife was unable to bear children, it was sometimes considered acceptable for her servant to bear a child on behalf of the household. The child would still be raised as part of the family and could inherit the responsibilities of the father's name. To modern readers, this practice may seem strange or uncomfortable, but within the world Abraham lived in, it was understood as a practical solution to a painful problem. The decision that followed did not arise from rebellion or disbelief. It came from a mixture of hope, desperation, and the desire to see the promise fulfilled in some visible way. Sarah, after years of waiting, suggested that Abraham take her servant Hagar as a secondary wife so that a child might be born through her. The suggestion must have carried enormous emotional weight. It was both a surrender to the reality of her own age and an attempt to protect the future of the household she had helped build. When Abraham agreed, the course of the family story quietly changed. What seemed like a solution to an impossible situation would soon shape the lives of everyone involved. From that decision would come the birth of Ishmael, the first son of Abraham, a child whose arrival appeared to bring the long-awaited answer to the promise that had hovered over the household for so many years. The birth of Ishmael changed the atmosphere of Abraham's household in ways that must have been both joyful and complicated. For years, the camp had lived with the quiet tension of waiting, watching time pass without any sign that the promise Abraham believed in would ever become real. Now, at last, there was a child, a son. In a world where family legacy depended on descendants, the arrival of Ishmael would have felt like the answer to long years of uncertainty. The biblical text records the moment simply without dramatic language, yet the significance of it would have been impossible to ignore. Ishmael was not only Abraham's first son, he was also the visible sign that the family's future might finally be secured. Servants, relatives, and members of the camp would have recognized what this meant. A household without an heir had suddenly gained one. The fragile question about Abraham's legacy seemed to have found its resolution. Yet beneath the relief that came with Ishmael's birth, the relationships inside the household began to shift in ways that the text quietly hints at. The arrangement that had brought Hagar into this role was never meant to be simple. She had originally been Sarah's servant, a woman whose life was bound to the authority of her mistress. When she became the mother of Abraham's son, Her position inside the household inevitably changed. She was no longer merely a servant performing daily tasks. She was now the mother of the child who appeared to carry Abraham's future. The Bible captures the tension that followed in only a few brief verses. Yet those lines reveal how quickly human emotions can complicate even the most carefully planned decisions. Hagar, now aware of the significance of the child she carried, began to see herself differently. The text suggests that her attitude towards Sarah changed, as though the balance of power between them had quietly shifted. What had begun as a practical solution to a painful problem suddenly became a source of rivalry and resentment. Sarah, who had initiated the arrangement in hope, now found herself facing the consequences of it. The presence of Hagar and her child would have been a constant reminder of what Sarah herself had long desired but had never experienced. The emotions surrounding that reality were almost certainly difficult to carry. In the ancient world, where honor and status were closely tied to motherhood, the situation placed Sarah in a deeply uncomfortable position within her own household. Abraham stood in the middle of this tension, responsible for maintaining peace within the camp, while also caring for the son who had just been born. The biblical narrative does not describe his thoughts in detail, but it shows that the conflict between Sarah and Hagar grew strong enough that it could no longer be ignored. What had begun as a hopeful attempt to fulfill the promise had now created a fragile emotional divide inside the family. At one point, the tension became so severe that Hagar fled from the camp altogether. Alone in the wilderness, she found herself in a place of fear and uncertainty, carrying Abraham's child while separated from the household that had once been her home. In the quiet isolation of that moment, the story reveals one of its most unexpected details. According to the biblical text, Hagar encountered a messenger of God who spoke to her directly. This moment is remarkable because it shows that Ishmael's story was never treated as insignificant. The message given to Hagar included a promise about her child. She was told that her son would grow into a great people and that his descendants would become numerous. Even in the earlier stages of the narrative, the text acknowledges that Ishmael's future carried meaning and importance within the broader unfolding of Abraham's story. Encouraged by this promise, Hagar returned to Abraham's household, and in time she gave birth to Ishmael. Abraham was 86 years old when the child arrived. For a man who had spent decades believing that his descendants would one day fill the land, holding his first son must have felt like the fulfillment of everything he had hoped for. The years of waiting appeared to be over. For a long time afterward, Ishmael grew as the only son in Abraham's camp. The biblical narrative moves forward quietly through these years, leaving much of daily life unspoken but easy to imagine. Ishmael would have learned to walk among the tents, to follow the flocks with the shepherds, and to watch his father lead the household through the routines of tribal life. Abraham, who had waited so long for a child, must have taken great pride in him. During those early years, there would have been little reason to expect that the story was still unfinished. From every practical perspective, Ishmael looked like the heir to Abraham's future. He was the firstborn son, growing up under his father's protection and surrounded by the people who formed the extended household. The promise of descendants seemed to have taken its visible shape through him. Yet the biblical narrative contains a quiet tension that remains unresolved during this period. The original promise given to Abraham had not been described as coming through Hagar. It had been spoken in connection with Sarah, even though she had long appeared unable to bear children. For years this detail might have seemed impossible to imagine, overshadowed by the reality of Ishmael's presence in the camp. As Ishmael grew older, the promise that had once sounded mysterious and distant began to return to the center of Abraham's life. The God who had spoken to him years earlier would soon repeat that promise in a way that would challenge everything the household had come to expect. For Abraham, who had already accepted Ishmael as the answer to his long years of waiting, this new revelation would force him to reconsider the meaning of the future he thought he understood. What made this moment so difficult was not the presence of doubt, but the weight of love. Ishmael was no longer simply a possibility or an idea. He was a living child who had grown within Abraham's care. Any change to the promise now carried personal consequences for everyone in the household. The story that had once seemed settled was about to become far more complicated than anyone could have predicted. Years passed in the quiet rhythms of camp life, and Ishmael continued to grow under the watchful care of his father. By the time Abraham reached 99 years of age, the boy had already spent more than a decade as the only son in the household. To everyone around them, the future seemed clear. Ishmael had become part of the natural order of Abraham's life. The child who would inherit responsibility for the flocks, the servants, and the fragile promise that had once seemed impossible. But the story of Abraham had never been guided only by what appeared reasonable. The promise that shaped his life had always come from beyond ordinary expectation, and now it returned with a force that challenged everything the family believed they understood. The biblical narrative describes a moment when God spoke again to Abraham, renewing the covenant that had first called him into an unknown land many years earlier. This time the promise was not vague or distant. It was spoken with startling clarity, as though the future was being revealed piece by piece in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Abraham was told that the promise of countless descendants would indeed be fulfilled, and that nations and kings would arise from his line. But the message did not stop there. Along with this declaration came a detail that must have felt almost unbelievable. The child who would carry the covenant forward, the son through whom the promise would unfold, had not yet been born. More astonishing still was the identity of the mother. The promise, God said, would come through Sarah. The statement must have struck Abraham with a mixture of wonder and confusion. Sarah had spent a lifetime believing that motherhood had passed her by. Her age alone seemed to make the idea impossible. Yet the message was clear. Within a year, Sarah herself would give birth to a son, and that child would carry the covenant that Abraham had been waiting to see fulfilled. For a man who had already embraced Ishmael as his heir, this announcement must have stirred deep emotions. The biblical text records Abraham's response with striking honesty. He fell face down in astonishment and laughed at the thought of a child being born to parents who had reached such advanced years. The laughter was not the laughter of disbelief alone. It carried the weight of a lifetime of waiting, the shock of hearing that the future might still hold something entirely unexpected. In that moment, Abraham spoke words that revealed the depth of his attachment to Ishmael. He pleaded that Ishmael might live under God's blessing and fulfill the promise that had already shaped the family's story. To Abraham, the solution seemed simple. The son he loved was already there, already growing into the role that destiny appeared to have prepared for him. But the answer he received changed the direction of the narrative in a way that could not be ignored. God acknowledged Abraham's concern for Ishmael and promised that the boy would indeed become the father of a great people. His descendants would multiply, forming tribes and nations of their own. The promise ensured that Ishmael's story would not disappear into obscurity. His future carried significance, dignity, and blessing. Yet the covenant itself would follow a different path. The child who would carry that covenant would be born through Sarah, and his name would be Isaac. The message did not erase Ishmael's place in Abraham's life, but it introduced a new layer of complexity that the household had never faced before. Ishmael had grown for 15 years as the only son, the visible hope of the promise Abraham had trusted for so long. Now another son would arrive, a child whose very existence would reshape the expectations that had slowly settled into the family. When Sarah eventually heard the news, her reaction mirrored her heir's aunt's. The idea of motherhood at her age felt almost absurd. The text records that she laughed quietly to herself, overwhelmed by the thought that such a miracle could happen after so many years of disappointment. Yet beneath the laughter was a mixture of disbelief and fragile hope, the kind that emerges when a long-closed door suddenly appears to open again. Time passed, and the promise that once seemed impossible began to move to fulfillment. The household that had grown accustomed to one son was preparing, perhaps cautiously, for the arrival of another. Ishmael, now entering adolescence, could not fully understand the meaning of what was about to happen. To him, Abraham's camp had always been the place where he belonged, where his father's affection and guidance shaped his future. But the birth of Isaac would introduce a change that no one in the household could completely control. The joy of a miracle often carries with it the tension of new relationships, new expectations, and new uncertainties. A family that had once seemed settled now found itself adjusting to a future that was larger and more complicated than anyone had imagined. When the child was finally born, Sarah's laughter transformed from disbelief into astonished joy. The son she had long believed she would never hold in her arms had become real. His name, Isaac, carried the memory of that laughter, a reminder of how extraordinary the moment truly was. Abraham, now 100 years old, witnessed the fulfillment of the promise that had guided him through decades of wandering and uncertainty. For a time, the household must have been filled with celebration. The birth of Isaac represented more than the arrival of a child. It symbolized the faithfulness of a promise that had once seemed unreachable. Servants and relatives would have recognized the significance of the moment, understanding that this boy carried the covenant that had defined Abraham's life. Yet beneath the joy lingered the quiet reality that two sons now stood at the center of the family's story. Ishmael, the firstborn, who had grown into young manhood, and Isaac, the miraculous child whose birth had reshaped the meaning of the promise. Their lives were now intertwined in a way that would soon test the fragile balance inside Abraham's household. The story that began with hope and patience was moving toward a moment where human emotions, family loyalty, and divine purpose would collide in ways that none of them could easily predict. The birth of Isaac filled Abraham's camp with a kind of joy that few had expected to witness. For years, the promise had existed as something distant and mysterious, spoken in moments of divine encounter but never fully visible in the ordinary routines of life. Now that promise had taken the form of a child lying in Sarah's arms. The woman who had once believed her chance at motherhood had passed forever could now look upon the son she had waited for through decades of quiet disappointment. For Abraham, the moment must have carried a profound sense of fulfillment. The God who had called him away from his own land had not forgotten the words spoken long ago. Life in the camp slowly adjusted to the presence of the new child. Sarah moved through their daily tasks, shepherds guided flocks across the hills, and the rhythms of survival continued as they always had. Yet beneath these familiar patterns, something had changed. Isaac's existence introduced center of attention, a fragile life that represented the covenant Abraham had been told would shape the future. Every smile, every small movement of the child would have reminded Sarah of the miracle she had experienced. Her laughter, once rooted in disbelief, now carried the joy of someone who had witnessed the impossible. But families rarely move forward without complexity. Within the same camp where Isaac was celebrated, another son had already spent years growing into his place in Abraham's life. Ishmael had once been the long-awaited answer to the promise. For 13 years he had known his father as the only son of the household, learning the customs of leadership and belonging within a community that expected him to inherit Abraham's legacy. The arrival of Isaac did not erase those years, nor did it immediately change the affection Abraham held for his firstborn. The Bible describes a moment that would later become one of the most discussed details in the entire story. As Isaac grew older, the time came when he was finally weaned, an event that in ancient cultures often marked a significant milestone in a child's early life. To celebrate the occasion, Abraham prepared a great feast. It was a moment of gratitude, perhaps even relief, acknowledging that the fragile child had safely passed through the earliest and most vulnerable stage of infancy. During this celebration, Sarah noticed something that disturbed her deeply. The biblical text describes Ishmael as laughing, though the exact meaning of that moment has been debated for centuries. The word itself leaves room for interpretation. Some readers believe it suggests harmless play between the boys. Others see it as mockery or tension between a young man and a small child who had suddenly become the center of attention in the household. Whatever the precise nature of the moment, Sarah's reaction was immediate and intense. She saw Ishmael not simply as another child within the family, but as a potential threat to the future she believed Isaac represented. To Sarah, The promise given to Abraham had finally arrived through her son. The idea that Ishmael might share in that inheritance felt intolerable. Her response carried the force of a mother determined to protect her child's destiny. She approached Abraham and demanded that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away from the household. The words she spoke were not gentle. She insisted that the son of the servant woman would never share in the inheritance meant for Isaac. For Abraham, the request must have been deeply painful. The biblical narrative does not describe his emotions in detail, but it makes clear that the matter troubled him greatly. Ishmael was not merely a complication within the household. He was Abraham's son, a boy he had watched grow from infancy into adolescence. The years they had spent together could not simply be erased by a sudden demand. In that moment, Abraham faced a choice that would test both his heart and his faith. The conflict between Sarah and Hagar had finally reached a point where the fragile balance within the family could no longer hold. If Ishmael remained in the camp, the tension between the women might continue to grow. Yet, sending the boy away meant separating from a child who had once represented the fulfillment of everything Abraham had hoped for. According to the biblical account, Abraham turned again to the God who had guided him through so many uncertain decisions. The answer he received acknowledged the difficulty of the situation, while also reaffirming the promise that had been spoken earlier. Isaac, the message confirmed, would carry the covenant. Through him, the line of descendants connected to that promise would continue. But the response did not ignore Ishmael. God reminded Abraham that Ishmael was also his son and that his future would not be abandoned. The boy would grow into a great nation of his own, blessed with descendants who would fill the land. The promise given to Hagar in the wilderness years earlier was now repeated, confirming that Ishmael's story would continue with meaning and purpose beyond the boundaries of Abraham's count. The following morning, Abraham prepared for a farewell that must have been heavy with emotion. He gathered provisions of bread and water and gave them to Hagar, placing the responsibility for Ishmael's future into her care. The text echoes the moment with quiet simplicity, yet the image it leaves behind is powerful. A father standing in the early light of day, sending away a son he loved, trusting that the God who had spoken promises would watch over the path ahead. Hagar and Ishmael departed into the wilderness, walking away from the tents that had once been their home. The open landscape stretched before them, filled with uncertainty and the quiet weight of a new beginning. For Abraham, watching them disappear into the distance must have been one of the most difficult moments of his life. Yet even in this painful separation, the story does not present Ishmael as forgotten or rejected by God. Instead, it reveals that his journey would continue under a promise of its own, a path that would unfold far beyond the boundaries of Abraham's household. The wilderness that stretched beyond Abraham's camp was vast and unforgiving. It was a land where the sun seemed to press down upon the earth with relentless heat, where long stretches of dry ground offered little shelter and even less certainty. For travelers moving through this terrain, survival depended on careful planning, knowledge of the land, and access to water that was often hidden or distant. Hagar and Ishmael now walked into this world alone, carrying only the small provisions Abraham had given them. At first there may still have been a quiet hope that the supplies would last long enough to guide them towards safety. Hagar had lived within Abraham's household for years, and she would have known the rhythms of desert travel. Yet, the wilderness has a way of quickly revealing how fragile human plans can be. The water they carried soon ran out, and the harsh reality of the desert began to close around them. Ishmael, who had once run freely among the tents of his father's camp, now faced exhaustion under the burning sun. The boy who had been raised with protection and provision suddenly found himself exposed to a landscape that showed little mercy. Hagar watched as his strength faded, realizing that the path before them was slipping beyond her control. The biblical text describes this moment with painful simplicity. When the water was gone, Hagar placed Ishmael beneath a small bush, seeking what little shade the desert could offer. The act carried a quiet desperation. She could no longer bear to watch the suffering of her son. The text tells us that she moved a short distance away and sat down. saying to herself that she could not endure seeing the boy die. The wilderness became a place of silence filled only with grief. Hagar wept openly, her voice rising in despair beneath the empty sky. It was the cry of a mother who had lost hope, a cry shaped by fear, exhaustion, and the crushing weight of believing that the life of her child was slipping away. Yet in the midst of that despair, the story turns toward one of its most striking moments. The God who had once spoken to Hagar when she first fled from Sarah's household now heard her again. The text says that God heard the voice of the boy, and a messenger called out to Hagar from heaven. The voice that answered her grief did not speak with anger or judgment. Instead, it spoke with reassurance, asking her why she was afraid and reminding her of the promise that had already been given about Ishmael's future. The boy, the voice declared, would live. His life carried purpose beyond this moment of despair. He would grow and become the father of a great nation. For Hagar, these words must have felt like the sudden return of light in a place that had seemed completely dark. The wilderness had appeared to close around them, offering no path forward. Yet the promise spoken to her earlier had not been forgotten. The story of Ishmael had not reached its end beneath that small desert bush. The text then reveals a quiet miracle that transforms the scene. God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well of water nearby. The source of life had been present all along, hidden within the landscape she had believed was empty. She quickly filled the water's skin and gave the boy something to drink, restoring his strength and pulling them back from the edge of tragedy. This moment is one of the most important details in the entire narrative. Ishmael was not abandoned in the wilderness as a forgotten child. The story carefully shows that God remained attentive to his life, hearing his cry and responding with provision and promise. The same divine presence that guided Abraham's journey also reached into the desert to protect the son who had been sent away. As Ishmael grew, the wilderness itself became his home. The biblical account tells us that God was with the boy as he matured, and he developed the skills necessary to survive in that rugged environment. The desert shaped his life in ways that were very different from the sheltered world of Abraham's camp. Instead of growing up surrounded by servants and flocks, he learned to live among the open lands, becoming a skilled archer who could navigate the challenges of the wilderness. Hagar remained with him during these years, watching as the child she had once feared losing grew into a young man capable of forging his own path. In time, she arranged a marriage for him with a woman from Egypt, connecting his future to the land from which she herself had come. Through this union, Ishmael's story continued to unfold, moving outward into the broader landscape of tribes and nations that filled the ancient world. Meanwhile, Abraham's household moved forward along a different path, shaped by the covenant that had been spoken over Isaac. The separation between the two sons created distance, yet it did not erase the shared history that bound them together. Both carried the blood of the same father, and both had received promises that their descendants would grow into great peoples. The biblical narrative does not linger long on the years that follow. Instead, it allows time to pass quietly, as though the story itself is stepping back to observe how the lives of these two brothers develop in different places. Ishmael grows strong in the wilderness, forming the beginnings of the nation that had been promised to him. Isaac remains within Abraham's household, gradually becoming the heir to the covenant that would shape the unfolding history of Israel. In this quiet unfolding, the story resists the simple idea that one brother's destiny erased the other's. Instead, it reveals two parallel paths, emerging from the same family, each guided by promises that reach beyond the immediate struggles of the household where their lives first began. Years continued to pass, and the distance between the lives of Isaac and Ishmael slowly widened. The paths that had once crossed within the same household were now unfolding in different landscapes. Isaac remained close to Abraham, growing up under the protection of the camp where the covenant had been spoken. Ishmael lived far from those familiar tents, shaped instead by the vast openness of the wilderness, where survival required strength, skill, and independence. The difference between their worlds could not have been greater. Isaac's life developed within the realms of Abraham's family, surrounded by servants, flocks, and the quiet expectations that he would one day inherit the responsibilities of his father. Every part of his upbringing was connected to the promise that had been spoken over him before his birth. The covenant between God and Abraham had now found its visible heir, and the people around the camp would have understood that Isaac carried a future larger than his own lifetime. Yet the biblical narrative does not portray Isaac's life as one of simple privilege. Growing up under the weight of a divine promise meant living with expectations that were both mysterious and demanding. Isaac would have heard the stories of how his father had been called away from a distant homeland, how a covenant had been established, and how the future of an entire people had somehow become linked to his own existence. These stories were not merely family memories. They were the foundation of the identity Isaac would carry for the rest of his life. Abraham himself had grown old by this time, his years stretching far beyond what most men in that world would experience. The promise that had once seemed distant had now become something he could see taking shape through Isaac's presence. Yet the aging patriarch must also have carried memories that reached beyond the child who now stood beside him. Ishmael remained part of those memories, a son who had once been the center of his hopes before the direction of the promise had been revealed in a different way. In the wilderness, Ishmael's life continued to unfold according to the blessing that had been spoken over him. The desert, which had once threatened his life as a helpless boy, became the environment that shaped his strength. Learning to survive in such a landscape required keen awareness and resilience. Water sources had to be discovered and protected, animals had to be hunted or raised with skill. Movement across the land demanded knowledge of shifting terrain and the subtle patterns of weather. These experiences forced Ishmael into a capable and determined man. The text describes him as becoming a skilled archer, a hunter who understood the demands of life beyond the protection of settled camps. His life in the wilderness brought him into contact with tribes and groups who navigated the same harsh environment, and over time his family began to grow into the beginnings of a larger people. The promise that had once been spoken to Hagar in the desert began to take shape through these years. Ishmael was not merely surviving, he was establishing a lineage that would stretch across the land. The ancient world was filled with tribes whose identities were tied to their ancestors, and Ishmael's descendants gradually formed their own place within that broader landscape of wandering peoples. Despite the physical distance that now separated them, the connection between Isaac and Ishmael was never completely erased. They shared the same father, and the memory of Abraham remained a thread that quietly linked their lives, even as their paths unfolded in different directions. The biblical narrative leaves much of the spirit unspoken, but the passage of time would have shaped both men in ways that reflected the environments where they lived. Isaac grew into adulthood with the understanding that he carried forward the covenant his father had received. His life would eventually lead him into marriage and the continuation of Abraham's line through new generations. The story of the people would later be known as Israel would move forward to him, shaped by the promise that had first been spoken in the quiet moments of Abraham's early journey. Ishmael's descendants, meanwhile, continued to spread across the wilderness regions surrounding the lands where Abraham had once traveled. Their identity developed through movement, trade, and survival in landscapes that required both strength and adaptability. The tribes that traced their lineage to Ishmael would become known throughout the region, fulfilling the promise that he too would father a great nation. What is remarkable about this stage of the story is how quietly the biblical text allows these parallel histories to develop. It does not describe constant conflict between the brothers, nor does it portray their lives as permanently locked in hostility. Instead, the narrative simply acknowledges that each man followed the path set before him, shaped by the promises and circumstances that had defined his beginning. Abraham himself continued to live long enough to witness the unfolding of these separate futures. The man who had once wandered into an unfamiliar land, guided only by a promise, could now see that his descendants were beginning to multiply in ways he had never fully imagined. Isaac stood beside him as the heir to the covenant, while Ishmael's growing lineage moved across the wilderness beyond the boundaries of the camp. The family that had once struggled with uncertainty had now expanded into something much larger than its earliest beginnings. Two sons had emerged from the same household, each carrying a different aspect of the promises spoken over Abraham's life. One would become the ancestor of the covenant people described throughout the later pages of the Bible. The other would father tribes whose presence would shape the history of the surrounding lands for generations. Yet beneath the expanding branches of these two lineages remained the memory of a single family, a household where the lives of Isaac and Ishmael had once overlapped before time and circumstance carried them in different directions. As the years moved steadily forward, Abraham's life approached its final chapter. The long journey that had begun when he left his homeland under the guidance of a mysterious promise was now nearing its conclusion. The man who had once wandered through unfamiliar lands with little more than faith now stood at the center of a family whose influence was beginning to spread across the region. The flocks that grazed across the hills, the servants who moved through the tents, and the children who had grown into adulthood all testified to the extraordinary life that had unfolded around him. Age had gradually slowed the strength that once carried Abraham across deserts and valleys, yet his presence still shaped the rhythm of the household. Isaac had grown into a man, prepared to inherit the responsibilities that had once rested on his father's shoulders. The covenant that had defined Abraham's life now continued through the son who had been born when hope seemed impossible. Beyond the boundaries of the camp, Ishmael's life had also expanded into something larger than the small beginning beneath the desert bush, where his survival had once hung by a thread. His descendants had multiplied, forming tribes that moved across the wilderness region stretching between the lands of Egypt and the territories where Abraham's family had settled. These tribes carried his name and identity forward, fulfilling the promise that had been spoken about him long before he had grown into manhood. Though Isaac and Ishmael had lived most of their lives apart, the memory of their father remained a shared foundation beneath the separate worlds they inhabited. Abraham's influence extended beyond the boundaries of a single household. His story had already begun to shape the identity of generations that would follow him. The moment eventually arrived when Abraham's long life reached its natural end. The biblical narrative records that he died at a good old age, having lived long enough to see his descendants grow and his household flourish. For a man who had once left everything familiar behind in obedience to a promise, the closing of his life carried the quiet dignity of someone who had witnessed the unfolding of that promise in ways he could not have predicted when the journey first began. What happened next is one of the most striking details in the entire story of Isaac and Ishmael. The text tells us that Abraham was buried by both of his sons. Isaac and Ishmael stood together to lay their father to rest. The moment is described briefly, almost quietly, yet the significance of it becomes clearer the more one reflects upon it. The two brothers whose lives had diverged so dramatically came together at the end of the man who connected them both. Isaac, the son through whom the covenant would continue, and Ishmael, the firstborn, who had grown into the father of a nation in the wilderness, now stood side by side in a moment of shared responsibility and memory. The Bible does not describe an argument between them at this time. It does not mention anger, rivalry, or hostility surrounding their meeting. Instead, the narrative presents a simple image of two sons honoring their father by ensuring he was buried with dignity in the cave of Machpelah, the burial place Abraham himself had purchased years earlier as a permanent resting place for his family. That cave already held the body of Sarah, the woman whose long wait for a child had shaped so much of the family's history. Now Abraham joined her there, completing the earthly story of the couple whose lives had carried the weight of a promise that stretched far beyond their own generation. The image of Isaac and Ishmael standing together beside their father's burial place invites quiet reflection. These were not merely historical figures separated by destiny. They were brothers whose lives had once overlapped within the same household, who had shared the same father and the early experiences of a family shaped by faith and uncertainty. Time had carried them into different worlds, yet the bond of their shared origin remained strong enough to bring them together in this final moment. After Abraham's burial, the narrative moves forward with the continuation of Isaac's story, tracing the line of descendants that would eventually form the people of Israel. At the same time, the Bible also preserves our record of Ishmael's lineage, listing the names of the 12 tribal leaders who emerged from his family. These two genealogies unfold alongside one another within the biblical text, reflecting the reality that both sons became the ancestors of growing nations. Each lineage expanded into its own identity, shaping the history of the lands where their descendants lived. What is remarkable is that the Bible does not portray these parallel histories as beginning with an unbreakable feud between the brothers themselves. The story of Isaac and Ishmael concludes the shared narrative not with a battle or a declaration of permanent utility, but with a quiet act of honor performed together. The simplicity of that moment raises an important question for anyone who studies the text carefully. If the two brothers were capable of standing together to bury their father, what does that suggest about the relationship between them? The biblical account leaves this question open, allowing the reader to reflect on the difference between what later traditions might assume and what the text itself actually describes. The story of Isaac and Ishmael, when read slowly and thoughtfully, reveals something far more complex than the idea of an inevitable rivalry. It shows two lives shaped by the same beginning, guided by different promises, and ultimately remembered within the same family history that began with a man who once believed that his descendants would become as numerous as the stars in the sky. When the story of Isaac and Ishmael is read within the broader flow of the Bible, it begins to reveal patterns that reach far beyond the lives of these two brothers. Their story does not stand alone. Instead, it reflects a recurring theme that appears again and again throughout the biblical narrative, the mysterious way in which promises, choices, and human relationships intertwine with a purpose that often unfolds in ways no one fully expects. One of the most striking patterns is the way God's promises often emerge through unlikely circumstances. From the very beginning of Abraham's journey, the path toward fulfillment rarely followed the straightforward expectations people might imagine. Abraham himself was called away from his homeland without knowing where he was going. Sarah was promised a child long after the natural time for motherhood had passed, and within the same household, two sons were born under circumstances that created tension, uncertainty, and difficult decisions. This pattern of unexpected outcomes continues throughout the generations that follow. The biblical text repeatedly presents moments where the future seems to move in directions that challenge ordinary assumptions. Younger sons rise to prominence over older brothers. Promises appear to pass through fragile circumstances rather than through obvious strength. Human plans often collide with divine intentions, producing results that no one could have predicted at the beginning. The story of Isaac and Ishmael fits directly into this larger pattern. In many ancient cultures, the firstborn son automatically held the primary inheritance and leadership within the family. By that custom, Ishmael would naturally have been expected to carry forward Abraham's legacy. He had been the first child born into the household, and for 13 years he was the only son Abraham knew. Everything about the structure of ancient family life pointed toward Ishmael as the future heir. Yet the covenant promise unfolded differently. The biblical narrative shows that the line through which that covenant would continue passed through Isaac instead. This choice was not based on Isaac's strength or accomplishments. When the promise was spoken, Isaac had not even been born. His life itself was already described as something miraculous, a child arriving when his parents had long believed such a possibility had disappeared. At the same time, the Bible does not present Ishmael as rejected or erased from the story. Instead, the text carefully preserves the promises spoken about him. He too would become the father of a great people, and his descendants would spread across the land in fulfillment of those words. The narrative acknowledges his importance within the broader history that unfolds beyond Abraham's immediate family. This balance is one of the most intriguing features of the biblical account. The story does not reduce the brothers into simple symbols of success and failure. Instead, it shows that both lives carried significance, even though their roles within the unfolding covenant were different. The promises spoken over each of them allowed their descendants to grow into distinct identities within the ancient world. The broader biblical narrative continues to echo this theme in later generations. Isaac's own sons, Jacob and Esau, would experience a similar tension surrounding inheritance and blessing. Once again, the expected order of birth would not determine the final outcome. Jacob, the younger brother, would become the ancestor of the nation of Israel, while Esau's descendants would form their own people in the surrounding lands. This recurring pattern suggests that the Bible is less interested in following predictable cultural expectations than it is in revealing how divine purpose can move through unexpected paths. Human families often struggle to understand these moments when the future unfolds differently than anticipated. The tensions between siblings, the pain of difficult decisions, and the uncertainty surrounding promises all reflect the deeply human experiences woven throughout these stories. In this way, the narrative of Isaac and Ishmael becomes part of a much larger reflection on faith and destiny. Abraham's life had been defined by the belief that God was guiding events toward a purpose that stretched far beyond his own understanding. The existence of two sons born under such unusual circumstances created a situation that required trusting promises that could not always be explained. Over time, the descendants of Esau would form the nation through which the covenant traditions of the Bible would be preserved. Their history would include moments of triumph, struggle, exile, and renewal, all shaped by the belief that their identity traced back to the promises given to Abraham. Meanwhile, the descendants of Ishmael continued to go across the desert region surrounding these lands. The tribes that traced their ancestry to him developed their own cultures, alliances, and histories. They became part of the wider network of peoples who moved across the trade routes and wilderness regions of the ancient Near East. What becomes clear when examining these developments is that the Bible recognizes the existence of both lineages without presenting their relationship as beginning with inevitable hatred between the brothers themselves. The story instead highlights how two branches of the same family expanded into separate futures, each shaped by the promises spoken at the beginning of their lives. When the narrative is placed within the larger framework of biblical storytelling, it reveals an important insight about how Scripture often approaches human conflict and destiny. The Bible frequently records tensions and rivalries within families, yet it also shows that these relationships exist within a larger story that includes mercy, blessing, and unexpected reconciliation. The lives of Isaac and Ishmael stand at the beginning of that pattern. Their shared origin within Abraham's household reminds readers that even when paths diverge, the roots of those paths often remain connected in ways that history sometimes forgets. Throughout the story, small details have quietly accumulated like scattered pieces of a puzzle. At first they appear ordinary brief verses, passing moments, simple actions recorded without explanation. Yet when those pieces are placed together and examined carefully, they begin to form a picture that looks different from the version many people assume they already know. The story of Isaac and Ishmael is often remembered as the beginning of an eternal conflict between two rival peoples. In popular imagination, the brothers themselves become symbols of division, their lives presented as the moment when history split into opposing destinies. But when the biblical text is read closely, that interpretation begins to feel less certain, because the Bible itself tells a quieter and more complicated story. It begins not with rivalry but with waiting. Abraham and Sarah lived for decades with a promise that seemed impossible to fulfill. Their decision to bring Hagar into the household was not driven by hostility but by desperation and hope. Ishmael was born into that moment as the first visible answer to a promise that had remained silent for years. For more than a decade, he lived as Abraham's only son, the child who carried the future of the family. When Isaac was later born through Sarah in a way that seemed miraculous, the situation within the household became painfully complicated. Human emotions, fear, jealousy, uncertainty began to shape decisions that would change the course of their lives. Yet even in the moment of separation, the biblical text refuses to present Ishmael as abandoned or rejected by God. In the wilderness, when Hagar believed her son was about to die, the narrative reveals that God heard the boy's cry and preserved his life. A promise was spoken over Ishmael as well. He would become the father of a great nation. From that point forward, the story quietly follows two parallel paths. Isaac grows within Abraham's household, becoming the heir to the covenant that would shape the identity of Israel. Ishmael grows in the wilderness, forming tribes that spread across the desert lands. Two sons, two promises, two futures unfolding from the same beginning. For much of their lives, the brothers live apart, their stories moving through different landscapes and cultures. If the narrative were meant to establish an immediate and permanent feud between them, this would be the moment where the Bible would emphasize hostility. Yet the text remains silent about such conflict between the brothers themselves. Instead, the most revealing moment appears at the very end of Abraham's life. When their father dies, the Bible records that both Isaac and Ishmael come together to bury him. The cave of Machpelah becomes the place where the sons stand side by side, honoring the man whose life had shaped both of their destinies. The narrative offers no description of anger, rivalry, or confrontation between them in that moment. It simply presents the image of two brothers fulfilling a shared responsibility. That quiet scene is one of the most overlooked details in the entire story. After everything that happened, the tensions within the household, the painful separation, the years spent living in different worlds, the Bible concludes their shared story not with a battle, but with a burial. The moment suggests something far more human than the simplified legend of eternal enemies, two brothers returning to honor their father. When the text is examined as a whole, the clues lead to a subtle but powerful realization. The Bible never declares that Isaac and Ishmael themselves were destined to remain enemies forever. What it records instead is a complex family story shaped by difficult choices, divine promises, and the unfolding of separate futures. Over time, their descendants would develop distinct identities and histories. Nations would rise, traditions would form, and later generations would interpret the meaning of these ancient relationships in many different ways. But the biblical narrative itself leaves the relationship between the brothers more open than many people expect. In fact, the final image the Bible gives us of Isaac and Ishmael is not one of conflict. It is one of reunion. Two sons standing together at their father's grave, connected by the memory of a man who once believed that his descendants would become as numerous as the stars above the desert sky. And perhaps that quiet moment is the final clue the story leaves behind. A reminder that the origins of history are often far more complicated and far more human than the legends that later generations build upon them.